Say something! Say something! Say something! Say something! Say something! What the media really loves, baby, is a sole survivor. Hello everyone and welcome to day 24 of Terrorthon Final Girl. If you've ever watched a horror movie, particularly a slasher horror movie, chances are you have seen this trope in action. But don't worry, if you've got absolutely no idea what I'm talking about, I'm going to explain it now. So the final girl trope refers to the sole survivor in a horror movie, as I said, especially a slasher. The villain of the horror movie will pick off every single character, leaving behind one female, who will be the one to take down the villain once and for all. Despite its sexist connotations, this trope still exists into the present day, but let's go back to where it first began with the very first final girl, Ellen in Nosferatu 1922. Despite the fact Ellen dies at the end, she is probably the earliest example of a final girl. In most horror movies from the 60s and before, women were always portrayed as victims of the monster, just running around screaming and not doing very much. But then when the final girl trope was introduced, it forced male viewers to identify with the final girl and see the world through a scared woman's eyes. You've probably heard of the trope where everyone in a horror movie who has sex dies, but the final girl is sexless and completely embodies purity. I suppose you could say that the first proper final girl was Sally Hardesty in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 1974. Despite the fact that she spends around the final 20 minutes of the film doing nothing but screaming, she is the sole survivor of her group and escapes Leatherface. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre essentially started this unusual trend, and it was followed up with the character Sue Snell in Carrie, which came out in 1976. Now she's very much a final girl when you consider that an entire school was burned to the ground, leaving behind pretty much only her. This is essentially how it unfolds in the novel as well, so I suppose you could say Stephen King is responsible for this particular final girl. And now we're getting into the really famous ones. We had Laurie Strode, the final girl of Halloween 1978. You may remember last year we did a video on Scream Queens. Well, the final girl and the Scream Queen essentially go hand in hand as demonstrated here. Next, another really famous example, Ellen Ripley from Alien 1979. Now, she wasn't the most capable of survivors in the original Alien, but in the sequel Aliens, she was an absolutely unstoppable badass, so the final girl has gained more and more power as time has went on. And then following up Laurie Strode as a slasher final girl, we had Alice from Friday the 13th 1980. Friday the 13th movies pretty much always have a final girl, because the franchise really leans into its horror trappings, for better or worse. And now that the trope was firmly established, we had a whole slew of final girls, including Nancy Thompson from A Nightmare on Elm Street. Of course, she was only the final girl in the first movie. If you've seen the series, you know what I'm talking about. Around this time, the trope became famous and began to be subverted with the likes of Sidney Prescott in Scream 1996, Buffy the Vampire Slayer from 1997 onwards. She got to fuck and do whatever the hell she wanted and still got to kick the monster's ass.
Whatever! I do what I want!
But the final girl doesn't always survive. Look at Candyman, The Descent. They don't always make it. Nowadays the trope is essentially made fun of with the likes of Cabin in the Woods in 2011, which also had Sigourney Weaver in it. Perfect, the original Ripley. However you feel about this trope and its sexist implications, it has a very important place in the history of horror, even if you, quite rightly, don't see it very much these days. See you tomorrow.